Hal Weitzman, editor-in-chief of the Chicago Booth Review, author of What's the Matter with Delaware? How the First State Has Favored the Rich, Powerful, and Criminal, and How It Cost Us All. Hal, thanks so much for coming on today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for inviting me on.
Of course. So, just some staggering statistics that I was not aware of until researching for this interview in your book. I did not realize that Delaware, one of the smallest states in the country, has 2/3 of U.S. public companies registered there, let alone private companies. And there are way more corporations than people in the state. I mean, I knew that it was the place to incorporate, and the Biden is the credit card senator, and that's where he was from. But I did not know how massive it was. I guess we can just start there, the sheer volume of corporations in the state of Delaware.
Yeah, I mean, so you put your finger on it. 2/3 of the biggest companies in America, the Fortune 500, are incorporated in Delaware. Of course, that doesn't mean they're actually there. Right? This is a legal fiction. It means that they have a registration in Delaware. And we can talk a little bit more, if you want, about what that means. But most companies of any size that are listed in the United States are incorporated or officially registered in the state of Delaware. As you said, Delaware has a population of just over 1 million people. So it's about the size of the Grand Rapids or Tucson metro area. But it has 1.8 million corporations that are legally there. Now, as I said, they're not physically there. You don't have to go to Delaware to register in Delaware. We can talk a little bit about the process, but these are not companies that have a physical location necessarily in Delaware, but they are officially registered in there and get various a variety of benefits from being there. So it's not just the credit cards, as you say, it's a whole variety of companies that you and I use every day. It's impossible to avoid Delaware. Delaware is everywhere. If you think about, just Google and Amazon and Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter and Visa or MasterCard or your phone, Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, Sprint. Delaware is the corporate air that we all breathe. If you're a consumer, then a lot of your day you are dealing with companies that are registered in Delaware. So it's really a huge part of the capitalist system. But as you say, because it's small, it kind of flies under the radar. We don't think a lot about Delaware. And that's what drew me as a writer to this story, was that it seemed very unexplored.
Well, its size, I think, is key to understanding Delaware, right? I mean, would it be safe to call Delaware a version of the Cayman Islands, except just domestically? Because it seems like there's something about the size of the state or a country that, relative to the others in its wheelhouse or in its proximity, that incentivizes, say, tax havens, corporate dodging, etc. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, I mean the size. So it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, it's no coincidence that countries that we think of as, and let's go beyond tax, right? Because tax is one aspect of it, but kind of secrecy jurisdictions, they tend to be smallish places, as you say, in the Western Hemisphere. That sort of, the sort of Panama. And various small Caribbean islands, and then in Europe places like Cyprus or the Isle of Man. So yes, the places tend to be small, and I think partly that's because it's easy to get everyone together. The elite tends to be pretty small in a small place. I mean, it tends to be pretty small in a big place, but even smaller in a small place. So it's easy to get everyone together. And often small places don't have big capacity to produce, let's say, manufacturing exports and things like that. So in Delaware's case, the size and the location is really important, right? It's not stuck out where like Wyoming, which is a state that would like to compete with Delaware, but is not very near the New York law firms and the corporate headquarters in Manhattan and New Jersey. So the location is really favorable as well, being so close to kind of the big financial and political centers of the United States. So the size helps people get together. It also means that the benefits, and we can talk a little bit about the system, but essentially Delaware has flipped the script on how states raise money. Most states depend on tax revenues. Delaware has a different system. It depends on fees. So each state, each of those 1.8 million
it's a state structured like some sort of financial institution.
Right. Well, I mean, another way of thinking about it is, your listeners will be familiar with Bernie Sanders' fundraising campaign, how Bernie changed the nature of fundraising so that instead of having a small number of large donors, a la Biden, you have a large number of small donors. And Delaware kind of follows that model, ironically, because it has a lot of corporations registered. None of them individually pays that much. Of course, if you're a big corporation, you pay more. But if you're a small corporation, you don't pay that much less. So they're all paying a relatively small amount of money. But because Delaware is small, that is materially important to Delaware in a way that it wouldn't be important to New York, California, Illinois.
Yeah, you write about the quote incorporation industry, and that churn is really fascinating to me. Can you expand a little more on what the process is for registering corporations in Delaware, the ease, the lack of oversight, accountability, all kind of with the explicit purpose of collecting these fees to run the state?
Well, it's super easy. In fact, you and I could set up a limited liability company in Delaware before the end of recording this podcast. And we wouldn't need to go to Delaware to do it.
Should we do that as an exercise? No, I'm just
Actually,
kidding.
there are many. If you look it up, and I recount them in the book. There's many people who've done NPR have done it, and various other people have done it. Yeah, it's very easy to do. You don't have to go to Delaware. You don't have to provide any documentation. So it's easier to get a company in Delaware than to get a library card in Delaware. Because to get a library card, you have to show some form of ID, but you don't need to set up a corporation. And then when we've set it up, and we can still do it because we still have time, when we've set it up, we don't need to put our names on it. We can be anonymous. So we can set up an anonymous corporation. And here's what makes it really convenient, because Delaware has set the whole thing up. You said Delaware is a bit like a financial company. In this sense, Delaware is much more like a financial services firm than a state. It has set its whole machinery up to service business people whenever they want to do this. So the office of the Secretary of State's Incorporation Office is open till midnight Eastern time. So, you can set up an anonymous company within 30 minutes. And I'm told by people who know these kinds of things that if you make the right phone calls, you can do it within more like 10 minutes. You don't need to, it's an anonymous company. We don't need to provide any documentation, and we can do it essentially in the middle of the night. So what kind of people would be interested in that setup? It doesn't take a big leap of imagination to show that's been used for nefarious ends.
Is there any real limitation on foreign incorporation?
Mm-hmm. So this is the part that I find quite scary. I don't know if you've ever written a story, or you're researching a story and you cannot quite believe that that's true. So you just have to, before it gets published, you have a little panic attack and you have to double check it. So that happened with me. Having written this book, researched it and written it over a period of like 5 years, I had a last minute panic, and I contacted the Secretary of State in Delaware just to check about this issue about foreign corporations. And the question I asked specifically was, what proportion of the 1.8 million companies registered in Delaware are foreign? By which I mean are controlled by people who are outside the United States, and what proportion are controlled by people within the United States? And they said, we don't know. And there is no way of knowing, because this don't ask, don't tell policy results in a situation where there's no transparency, not only to us, but to them as well. And this has been very frustrating over the years for example, for law enforcement when they're trying to trace international money laundering or drug trafficking or people trafficking, and the trail leads to Delaware. Often that was a cold trail because there was no there. There's nothing to find because they didn't even ask the questions about who controls the companies.
I mean, I want to get into some of the state legislative, the state legislators and where they have dropped the ball, perhaps intentionally, in a bit. But before we get to that, I wanted to go through the history to see how Delaware did become this home for corporations, because you write about this, and this is fascinating. I'm from New Jersey, so this could have been me, right? That they did take the mantle from New Jersey in the early part of the 20th century, if you don't mind taking us through that.
I'm
history.
glad you're asking me this, because I had a review in the Financial Times, my old paper, and they said there was too much history. But I think you have to understand the history, otherwise you don't understand how we got there. And then there's all sorts of narratives about we won. Well, the important part is Delaware didn't get this industry because it had a better business model. It copied the business model that New Jersey had previously had. So the potted version is this: at the end of the 19th century, New Jersey allowed holding companies where one company could own another, essentially. And then it relaxed all sorts of rules on corporate structures. And because of that, all sorts of companies from all over the United States moved to New Jersey, officially, legally speaking. And they were attracted by this kind of more lax structure, the ability to do anything via a holding company registered in New Jersey. And so by like 1911, the fees from this business accounted for about a third of New Jersey's state revenues. And other states, particularly Delaware, copied these regulations, but they couldn't get much traction. Then there was the famous election of 1913, when Taft was the president, and the people running against him were Woodrow Wilson from your state, your home state, and Teddy Roosevelt. And as part of the campaign, it was a three-way election. Teddy Roosevelt, if you remember, was the progressive candidate. And during the campaign, Teddy Roosevelt kind of barbed Woodrow Wilson, saying, you say you want to rein in corporations, but you have all these corporations running around in New Jersey doing what the hell they like. And Woodrow Wilson, of course, wins the election. But during that lame duck period, because he was the governor back in New Jersey, during that period where he's transitioning from being the governor to being the president, he went back to New Jersey with this kind of zeal to reform the system. And he and his allies in the legislature passed a whole load of bills that basically neutered the ability to do this holding corporation scheme and tightened up the rules about corporate structures. And the business, as had been predicted, fled New Jersey and went to neighboring Delaware, which hadn't done anything innovative other than copy what New Jersey was doing. And of course, Delaware welcomed all these companies with open arms. So it kind of picked up this crown that New Jersey had deliberately thrown down. And now the situation is the same for Delaware. Now corporate fees account for about unassociated revenues like abandoned property, gift cards that you didn't spend all the money on, all that money cumulatively that goes to Delaware accounts for about 40% of its state budget. So it needs this business. That goes back to the size. It needs this business. It cannot afford to do anything that might threaten this so valuable source of revenue.
It's fascinating, and this is a bit of an aside, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts on this also being a time when before this business fled New Jersey, there was a lot of organized crime and corruption within the state and state governments. Is that a coincidence in your mind? Did you come across any of that in your research?
You mean so organized crime in Delaware?
Well, in Jersey, because now I feel like this is a much more white collar version of like, say, what's being depicted in Boardwalk Empire, right, or something like that.
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know. I'm not able to shed much light on that. Maybe I'll write a book about New Jersey next, and then
there you go.
You can advise me on that one.
So another thing you talk about there, you call the industry essentially where businesses are created the franchise. How do you define that? What does the franchise within Delaware entail?
Well, I didn't come up with that phrase, the franchise. That's
Gotcha.
what they call it. They call it the franchise, which is shorthand for the system whereby companies are registered in Delaware, the legal infrastructure, which is, a little complex, but they have specific business court, a chancery court. So when you see about cases, the most recent high-profile one being Twitter versus Musk, these take place in the Chancery Court, specific dedicated court for business cases, which means everything's more efficient, more effective, and supposedly has a lot of expertise and predictability and case law. So a lot of stuff you can do your research about. So that's part of it. There's a bankruptcy system. So Delaware makes a lot of money through its bankruptcy courts. All of this feeds back. I say in the book that Delaware is like the closest thing that America has to a corporate version of the registrar of births, marriages, and deaths. So companies go there to be born, in other words, to get registered. They go there to get married, if you will. Here the analogy is starting to fall apart, or get divorced, or have beefs with each other, because that's where the courts come in, and then deaths because of bankruptcy. So all of that collectively is called the franchise. Plus, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, a very nice little side business, which is abandoned property. So if you have a few cents in a bank account, or overpaid a credit card and there's a few cents there, or a couple of dollars in a stock trading account or crypto account or whatever, and that company is registered in Delaware, that so-called abandoned property, because after a few years that money is declared legally abandoned, that reverts to the state of Delaware. And states do various things with those. Most of them hold it in a separate account and look for the people who actually own the money, but Delaware just spends that money, and that's a nice $500 million a year business for Delaware, abandoned property. So all of that taken together is considered to be the franchise. And as I say, financially, that is so important for Delaware, and it's important for Delawareans because it's estimated that Delawareans only pay about 50 cents on the dollar for every dollar of service they receive. So they call it let me get my colors right, because I think it's so a red. Is that right? Red is Republican. So red taxing state. It's a red taxing state with blue spending. So every politician's dream: low taxes, high spending, and a lot of that is paid for with corporate fees.
I mean, the franchise tax as well. Can you talk about that as well? What that entails, and like essentially the tax that bridges the gap that you described there.
Yeah. So as I say, it's a pile them high and sell them cheap type business. High volume, costs a few $100s. We still have time if you want to create that corporation before the end of the podcast. But if we do it, we have to pay a fee, depending on how quickly we want to do it. And the fee that we would pay to set up a limited liability company, you've probably heard of those, right? Limited liability companies account for about 70% of all the companies that are set up in Delaware. And there are about 1,000 companies being set up every day in Delaware. So 700 of those, more or less, are limited liability companies on average. So the rest are what so-called, I mean, it's a little technical, but C corporations, like the big listed companies that were, the sort of, I was thinking of Bath and Body Works, these kind of, or whoever, the big MasterCards and everyone else, they are C corporations. They pay higher fees, but most of what's set up is a pretty low fee. In other words, a few $100s for the basic level of service. But if you aggregate all that up, it adds up to a significant amount of revenue for Delaware, probably close nowadays to about $2 billion in fees alone, which for a small state like Delaware is extremely significant. And as I say, add in all these adjunct source streams of revenue, you get to about 40% of the state budget. And they really have, as I said earlier, flipped the script. So Delaware collects more in corporate fees than 42 other United States collect in corporate taxes. So they have completely changed the model. Very innovative, not very easy to copy. There's several other states that would like to, like Nevada, but they haven't been able to. But they have completely flipped the script and made themselves financially much more secure. But having said that, if there's any sniff from regulators or the federal government that this might be shut down, it would be financially disastrous for Delaware.
Yeah, I mean, and you talk about the relative proximity to New York and stuff giving it an advantage. Delaware close to DC as well, and that's, I guess, where we can move in a second. But I did want to ask you also about the preponderance of single-use LLCs. So this was something I wasn't aware of, right? I mean, you just talked about LLCs and how ubiquitous they are, how widely used they are. But I didn't even know that there's something where you can essentially, it's like a disposable LLC where you can use it one time and throw it away. And that exists in Delaware as well, if you don't mind talking a bit more about that.
And not just Delaware, to be fair, anywhere. I mean,
Right.
it's like a plastic straw. You're absolutely right. So if you and I wanted to use our new LLC in Delaware to bring some money over from wherever, South America, we would do that transaction through using the LLC, and then we might decide we might basically abandon it. Next year we got to pay our fees again. We might decide we don't pay the fees. The challenge here, as an academic, because I am at University of Chicago, so I'm trying to approach this as a little bit in an academic way and look for data. The challenge is there isn't a lot of data on single use versus repeated use, so we don't know. I have heard just anecdotally from my sources in Delaware that there's a lot of this single use, which makes sense because if we want to do a one-off transaction, we wouldn't necessarily want to use that LLC again. And because of the nature of limited liability, if we were to do an additional transaction, we might not want any fallout from the first transaction to affect the second. And that's often how limited liability is popular, exactly for that reason. I'll give you a more kind of prosaic example. I'm sure many of us have stayed at an Airbnb. Airbnbs increasingly are registered as single limited liability companies. And what you've probably experienced if you have stayed at an Airbnb is that you try and call the owner and there isn't an owner. It's a company in New Jersey or wherever, and they control 55 Airbnbs all over the country. And each one of them is an individual LLC. Now, one of the reasons I found out about that is because a little quirky thing that happens in Delaware, LLCs are so important to Delaware that in some places they are allowed to vote in elections. They are allowed to vote in special elections. So in Newark, Delaware, as they pronounce it locally, they had a special election. And they, under the rules that they have, each LLC can vote separately, which enabled one person to vote 31 times in that special election because they had 31 individual properties, each of them registered as a separate LLC. So this LLC thing is very widely used. And as far as I know, quite a lot of it is used as single use, which, as you say, for Delaware itself, means that they got to sell, which gives the whole industry a little bit of a Ponzi aspect to it.
So if I'm hearing you right, LLCs statutorily are allowed to vote in elections in Newark, Delaware? I just want to emphasize that again.
Special elections, yeah, and I write also in Rehoboth Beach, where our president has his second home. Yeah, the LLCs can vote, companies can vote because they're property owners. Think about it. The property is owned by an LLC. So just as an individual property owner might be able to register to vote, the LLC can vote in special elections, not in the... Now, there was a proposal, which is why I wrote about it, in Rehoboth Beach, which is the resort where lots of people from DC have summer homes, that there was a proposal in Rehoboth Beach that they be allowed to vote in all elections, but that was not popular, so it was dropped. But still, in special elections, things like tax raising elections, they are allowed. LLCs are allowed to vote. Yeah. So you had one individual voting 31 times.
I mean, man, corporations are people according to the Supreme Court, but that really takes it to a whole nother level. You just mentioned Biden there, and I think it's important that I ask you about it. I mean, this is his state. He served as the senator for one of the two senators from Delaware for nearly 2 decades, from the early 70s until he became vice president. Um, you know, he's been called the credit card senator. I think his reluctance to relieve student debt is deeply tied to his ties to these kinds of corporations and credit card companies, moneyed interests. And I also think that Chris Coons, his the current person who holds that Senate seat, and I think Biden has really tried to make him in his image, holds many of these attitudes as well. In your research into Delaware, what was Biden's explicit connection to this kind of industry or Ponzi scheme of LLCs and incorporation, as you discuss, and his attitude towards it?
So I would say that he didn't create the system. I mean, it's been around for over 100 years. But he is very much a creature of the system. So if you look at, as you say, his voting record, and in the book I also talk about his voting record on busing, which is related to attitudes in Delaware as well, and the more conservative aspects of Delaware's politics around race relations are reflected in its attitude towards corporations as well. I mean, it's no coincidence that states that used to be slave-owning states, like Delaware, tend to be more conservative to when it comes to businesses as well. So that's one aspect. The credit card thing is huge because, as we may have said earlier, 4 out of the 5 biggest credit card companies are located in Delaware. And why? Briefly, because in the early 1980s, Delaware invited 2 of the biggest credit card issuers in to write its regulations to make it more favorable to them. And they got rid of all interest rate caps, thereby getting rid of all interest rate caps in the whole United States, because any company can just register in Delaware, get around any local interest rate caps. So credit cards is a huge one. But then if you look at who funded Biden's campaign, up until he was running with Obama, his top donors to his Senate campaigns were all the biggest law firms in Delaware that make the rules, that argue the cases, and that collect the fat fees. And so they live on they parasites, essentially, and creators of this system. And so they are the big movers and shakers in Delaware. And he very much was funded by that system. So he has had no interest in challenging the system at all. But as you said, the other 2 senators, Carper, Coons, have also had no interest in challenging the system. If anything, they might have been more strident in defending some of its more nefarious aspects, such as corporate anonymity in Congress.
Yeah, Chris Coons at Davos last week, just chilling with Cinema and Manchin. He's one of the people that I think gets flies a little bit under the radar, but fills a very similar role that those two do within the Democratic Party.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. So Coons being a great example, everybody's friend, right? Like you said, very much a centrist type figure between the 2 parties. And Biden is similar kind of character. And they have this system in Delaware, which they call the Delaware Way, which officially means to people who like the Delaware Way will say, well, what it means is we all get together on, everyone knows each other, and we get together and we sort things out, which is kind of what Biden has always said. And sometimes it's worked out on Capitol Hill and sometimes it hasn't. More often probably hasn't than has. But in Delaware, what it really means is that we all know what we want to do, which is keep this system going. And we're going to write rules behind closed doors. We're going to rush them through the state legislature so there's no proper debate. For example, the way that the corporate code gets made in Delaware is that there's a committee of the Delaware Bar that writes changes to the code every year in secret, gives them to the state legislature, which is a part-time body that has no lawyers in it barely and has no capacity to evaluate these changes. So they basically just rubber stamp them. And then the governor also has no capacity or interest in challenging these or questioning them, and also rubber stamps them. So you have a system where these working lawyers from the Delaware bar make the rules that they themselves will appear in court under, which could always seem to me like the fox guarding the hen house. So these lawyers are the very ones who've been creating the system, keeping it going. Big law firms based in all around the what used to be called Rodney Square in the middle of Wilmington. And these are the ones who backed Joe Biden for the past 40 years. Yeah,
I mean, I think it's just important, if not uncomfortable, to acknowledge that, because he might have moved past it. He might have been vice president. He might have more progressive people on his staff, but that 40 years of being a creature of that political system is in him still, right? And if you want to understand his instincts or his kind of desires as president, you have to understand that.
I think it's even worse than that. He's proud of it. If you go to White House website and look back on some of the speeches and look up where he's mentioned Delaware, he always says proudly, "We're the corporate state," you know. So he's very proud of Delaware's record as a home of corporations. But the dark side of that is anonymous corporations and all the ways they've been misused for, as I say, from money laundering, international crime, drug smuggling, arms smuggling, people trafficking.
Well, Hal Weitzman, I can't recommend this book enough. It's called "What's the Matter with Delaware? How the First State Has Favored the Rich, Powerful, and Criminal, and How It Costs Us All." Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Same here.